Let's see, can we hear, do you want to say something? Hello, can you hear me? Yay.
Yes, thank you.
All right, hello, sorry. Well, can everyone hear me now? Yes? Yeah? Okay. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you to Annika, Felicitas, Emily, Christine. I'm really happy to be with you guys. And thank you for tuning in virtually. I'm going to try to share my screen. Okay. Can everyone see that? My slideshow. Okay, there we go. I swear I know what I'm doing. So without further ado, I'm going to get started. In her 2013 book on intellectual activism, Black feminist sociologist Patricia Hill Collins describes intellectual activism as and I quote, the myriad ways that okay, that's okay. The myriad ways that people place the power of their ideas in service to social justice, end quote. The negotiation of shifting notions of exclusion and inclusion, as well as belonging and unbelonging, also characterize intellectual activism. For Collins, there are two strategies that undergird intellectual activism. They include speaking truth to power, which seeks to challenge the status quo and power hierarchies, and speaking truth to people, means disseminating knowledge widely through the visual arts, music, poetry, fiction, essays, journal articles, nonfiction, books, and videography. This work entails the commitment of activist intellectuals, artists, and others who use multiple expressions of intellectual activism for social justice in the everyday. These different forms of creative work gave rise to social movements against racism and other forms of discrimination in and beyond Europe. This was certainly the case for Black German activist intellectuals whose creative work helped them produce and establish a diasporic and anti-racist movement in the 1980s and 90s. In their movement, they used their intellectual activism to challenge normative notions of whiteness and confront Black people's historical erasure in the German nation, while also relying on diverse tools that rendered everyday and institutional racism visible. Black Germans offer an example of intellectual activism in practice, in which they centered excluded narratives of African-descended peoples, especially their cultures, thoughts, and cosmologies, and used their marginalized positions in Germany to reclaim control and agency, and legitimize their modes of being and knowing. Indeed, Black German women were key innovators of intellectual activism in the movement. They proved how power and knowledge were generative and liberating, enabling new ways of thinking, understanding, and acting out personal and/or collective identities. Their forms of knowledge production and circulation allowed them to exist beyond the narrow confines of the Enlightenment construction of man, who oftentimes was always rendered able-bodied, cis-white, and non-queer. And here I'm thinking about the work of Sylvia Wynter, who's also a Black feminist theorist, who talks about the overrepresentation of man in terms of this Enlightenment abstract idea of man. That abstract idea of man is actually very gendered and racialized. And she's talking about how non-white subjects are countering that. So in this presentation, she's sort of chilling in a couch, doing her intellectual thing in the image. So in this presentation, I argue that Black German women such as Maya Angelou and Ricky Reiser became what I refer to as quotidian intellectuals. It's a concept that I discuss in my book, which Emily showed you, but then bling, there it is again, you know. And it's basically this idea that they impart different kinds of knowledge through multiple mediums that relied on everyday aesthetics and vernacular forms, such as graphic work, diasporic symbols, workshops, and spoken word poetry. Black Germans stress their creativity, signaling why material, cultural, and geographic contexts mattered. These quotidian intellectuals countered their historical and intellectual erasure by normalizing the field of Black German studies. and inventing new definitions of intellectualism in the process. Their intellectual pursuits empowered them to cultivate connections with their Black counterparts across Germany and the globe. As examples of quotidian intellectuals, I focus on Maya Ayim and Ricky Reiser, but certainly other women and men in the Black German movement, such as Katharina Montoya, Marion Kraft, John Kantara, Tahir Della, and Helga Emda were as well. Yet Reiser and Ayim, both prominent figures in the Black German movement, for different reasons, made significant epistemic interventions that allow them to write themselves into history and recover narratives that were not found in traditional German spaces or archives. And what I mean by that, you're probably like, what? What's she saying there? I'm basically saying that they're challenging forms of knowledge, challenging new ways of being in interesting ways. So they're looking at poetry as a site for knowledge production. They're looking at like hip hop as a site for knowledge production, all in ways that challenge what Germans constitute, what Germans think intellectualism can be, okay? So without further ado, and I'm saying that these acts, basically, these epistemic acts, they're creating new vocabularies, creating all of these new forms, are acts of remembrance and recovery. And in the process, they're decolonizing German knowledge. And they're decolonizing German knowledge by also what Black feminist scholar Brittany Cooper refers to as listing. She talks about this idea of listing and beyond respectability, and there's like an image of Brittany Cooper. And listing was a historically rooted process that allowed African-American women in the United States to create a genealogy of Black women's intellectualism by recognizing their lives and scholarship and resisting their intellectual erasure. For Black German women in particular, listing in journals and poetry, along with other political events, afforded them an opportunity to document the narratives of Black diasporic figures from the past and present, and to carve out a space for the Black diaspora and Black Germanists in the German nation. Together, these women's actions and ideas exemplify how the Black German movement was not only a site for lobbying and political work, but also intellectualism. I'm gonna sneak my water here. Without a doubt, Black Germans' politics and poetics demonstrate how the production and dissemination of their knowledge proved to be a source of power, resistance, and solidarity. In the movement, Black German quotidian intellectuals like Reiser and Ayim created Blackened knowledge. And this idea of Blackened knowledge comes from another Black feminist scholar, Christina Sharp, from In the Wake. And this Blackened knowledge helped to undercut the power of dominant knowledge and representations of the Black diaspora. And they're rejecting negative assumptions about Blackness. So they're also rejecting this idea that Blackness is automatically associated with criminality or foreignness or these negative connotations. They're challenging that. With their forms of intellectual activism, both women affirmed their agency and exercised power that they used in the service of the larger Black German community. And they also used in the service of other marginalized people locally, nationally, and internationally. Can everyone still hear me? Okay, good. For Reiser, she did this through her editorial work, her writing, and her artwork in Afro-Look, a prominent Black German magazine. Her cultural and political work was rooted in, yet extended beyond the German nation. In Afro-Look, she gave space to other forms of knowledge that were marginalized or ignored in the German mainstream. With Ayim, she accomplished this through her grassroots activism, in which she engendered and imparted knowledge to diverse audiences in Germany and beyond. Through their industry of making different forms of art and literature, these quotidian intellectuals contributed to a Black public sphere and challenged Black Germans' exclusion from the nation. The first section of my paper shows how knowledge and power underpinned Black German activism in their movement. Power emerged in critical ways for Black German quotidian intellectuals in their words and in their actions. The second section turns to Reiser and Ayim and recognizes how power, knowledge, and resistance worked for them. Their internationalism compelled them to form connections with diverse individuals, and their intellectual activism grounded them. Through their work, they brought the Black diaspora from the margins to the center, disrupting normative forms of German knowledge. Both women reveal how intellectual activism was, and I quote again, a multifaceted phenomenon that linked content and process, ideas and action, oppression and resistance, end quote. Reisers and Naim's involvement in the modern Black German movement marked a significant stage in their lives. Let me now turn to that movement. The modern Black German movement began in the mid-1980s with the establishment of two cultural and political organizations, the Initiative of Black Germans, or Initiative Schwarze Deutsche, and Afro-German Women, or Afro-Deutsche Frauen, or ADEFRA. And here you have two brochures, one from the local group ISD Munich from 1989, and then another brochure from ADEFRA from 1993. And these are certainly very old school. So they're not necessarily going to Kinko's and having people photocopy this for them. They're doing it themselves. They're cutting out outlines and photocopying them multiple times themselves. ISD was an anti-racist organization that arranged consciousness raising workshops, social gatherings, and anti-discrimination protests. ADEFRA, its sister organization, was a feminist organization that focused on anti-racism, feminism, and diasporic themes. Local chapters for both organizations emerged in cities across West Germany, and in later former East German cities. In addition to local chapters and organizational events, ISD published Afro-Look in 1988 to 1999, and ADEFRA produced Afriketta from 1988 to 1990. So they both of these organizations, ISD and ADEFRA, published two forms of magazines. So one is a little bit longer lasting than the other. And these magazines were very much important for community building and for cultural expression. Afro-Look and Afriketta contributed to a Black public sphere in Germany that included other journals such as AWA Findaba, which was an African cultural and literary magazine from 1983 to 1988. And then there was also another magazine entitled Is Vivian, and it was again another African diasporic journal, basically published by African writers and artists, some expats who were living in Germany from the period of like 1990 to 1992. Caribbean American author and activist Audre Lorde has often been described as a catalyst for the Black German movement. But she was one of many diasporic resources that Black German quotidian intellectuals relied upon during the early stages of the movement. And here is a great image of Audre Lorde, Katharina, and Mai. Get an image of people that I'm talking about in the talk, especially Mai, and they're hanging out. Audre Lorde, who's the individual with the tag Audre Lorde in the middle, surprise, was a visiting professor at the Free University in Berlin from April to July of 1984. And Lorde's interactions with Black German women, such as Mai and Katharina, inside and outside the classrooms, proved to be very important for the formation and growth of their new movement. Aim and Oguntoya's conversations with Lorde, and especially with one another, led to what I see as one of the first interplays of power and knowledge in the initial stages of the movement. They, with Lorde's support, created a new lexicon with the designations of Afro-Germans, Afro-Deutsche, and Black Germans, or Schwarze Deutsche. And these concepts offered new forms of Black knowledge that disrupted the fixity of German identity as based on whiteness alone. And here I just want to sort of quickly, a quick aside, is that Black Germans are very diverse. So they come from a variety of backgrounds. So some of them are mixed race, some of them have one parent that's white, one parent that's Black. Some of them have ancestry from Europe, the US, Latin America, the list goes on. So it's a very diverse group of people who are still trying to come together at this moment. So it's through their differences that they find a form of connection. Oguntoya and Naim in particular engage Edward Bonilla Silva's concept of a racial grammar, which, and I quote, influence their vision, emotion, and sense of aesthetics, in addition to the way that Germans talk about and frame racial matters, end quote. These women instantiated their imagined community through language, shifting normative ways of knowing. Oguntoya and Naim also recognized Germany's social organization centered on their exclusion and difference, and signified unequal power relations among governmental institutions, state and federal, Black Germans, people of color, and their white German counterparts. Their acts sought to unsettle and contest those power dynamics. These women and others in the movement imbued Blackness with new political and intellectual meanings, defying racist discourses that previously excluded and silenced them. And it's pretty important that they're doing this at this particular time. So like, oftentimes we hear, well, maybe you don't. So I should say that the Black German case is very interesting because people are often like, Black Germans, do they exist? Black people exist in Europe, in Germany in particular. And yes, and that's going back to this larger idea of them being a very, very diverse population. Some of them have ancestry from German colonists. So some of them can date back their heritage to Namibia, to Tanzania, to sort of Afro-Cuban connections. So there's a very much a community with a plethora of cultural and social identities that then they used to come together in the 80s. And this coining of the terms Afro-German and Black German occur in the 1980s. So prior to that moment, they're called offensive terms that I'm not even going to repeat to you. So we're going to move on from that. But it's important to show that this is them responding back to that in a positive way. And I'm also arguing that's an act of intellectualism. And that's an important moment for them. Their efforts at renaming were cultural and political acts that served, again, as an epistemic intervention, and that enabled Black Germans to enter the public sphere on their own terms. Historically, African-descended peoples were either included in the public sphere in degrading ways, such as the Völkerschau tradition, or the people's show or human zoo tradition in Germany. So in the 19th century, there literally were like human zoos in Germany, in which they had individuals of African descent traveling to a variety of cities, placing them on display. Not only a German dynamic, but a sort of larger European context. Also interesting shows taking place in Central and Eastern Europe too in the 19th century. So this is a larger fascination with people who are non-white and like sort of putting them on display and fetishizing them in ways. African descended peoples were also excluded from the public sphere because they were considered what Angela Zimmerman has referred to as natural peoples. Individuals allegedly lacking history and culture and presumed to be inferior to Europeans who were cultural peoples. Moreover, white Germans practiced what Morris Ega has called an Afro-Americophilia that involved the appropriation, exoticization, and celebration of African-American pop culture. As a result of this common practice, white Germans tended to accept and celebrate Black diasporic writers and activists such as Toni Morrison, Angela Davis, or Alice Walker, who were routed to but not rooted in the German nation. But before I show you images of those two, here's another wonderful image of Audre Lorde and Maya Angelou hanging out. They remained very close until Audre Lorde's death. And here is a lovely image of Toni Morrison, and also an image, a flyer of the Free Angela Davis campaign that occurred. So Angela Davis was arrested. Maybe some of you know that, maybe you don't. And there was actually a global campaign to get her released. And the East German government actually helped and encouraged their citizens to participate in the movement. But there was also people who were writing from Japan, all over the world, to try to release Angela Davis. And so this is one of the flyers for the Freedom for Freiheit für unsere Angela Davis. So that's from 1971. Therefore, Black German self-definition and curation empower them after enduring years of invisibility and loneliness in a majority white German polity. Through their organizing, they engendered new productive spaces and meanings of resistance, identity, and belonging, that of course evolved throughout their movement. Aim, Oguntoya, and other quotidian intellectuals also dealt with the epistemic violence of the pervasive exclusionary German discourses that were normalized and codified in legislation at the state and federal levels, in institutions, i.e. archives and schools, and in everyday parlance and practice. In this regard, Marisa Fuentes' work on enslaved women in 17th century Barbados has been useful. Marisa's work on enslaved women is very interesting for a variety of reasons, but she studies them for this. According to Fuentes, enslaved women appear as historical subjects through the form and content of archival documents and the manner in which they lived, spectacularly violated, objectified, disposable, hypersexualized, and silenced. This violence is transferred from the enslaved bodies to the documents that count, condemn, assess, and evoke them, and then receive them in this condition. So this is a very interesting quotation because she's basically saying documents are violent. The archives are a violent space. The experience of some Black Germans is not necessarily entirely located in the narrative of slavery or the Middle Passage. And colonization occurred outside of Germany's borders, even though it assisted in the creation of those same borders and institutions. But this is also how individuals of African descent have historically appeared in Germany, spectacularly violated, objectified, disposable, hypersexualized, and silenced. Thus, Black Germans' act of renaming and curating was a mode of resistance against Germany's imposition of otherness and the privileging of what Black German scholar Maisha Uma refers to as a super whiteness. So I should also clarify that there's this sense that, Aryanness, this is a super whiteness that is very significant and normalized in the German context. This knowledge emboldened them to rebel against Germany's racecraft, calling attention to how said racecraft impinged on the rights of many minoritized communities inside and outside of the nation. And here, Black Germans and other individuals of color in the German context are talking about German colonialism. Like they keep sort of stressing the importance of that German colonial moment, even though it was so fleeting. And even though Germans thought that they were good colonizers, no one was a good colonizer. No one gets a gold, no one gets a bronze, no one gets a silver for being a good colonizer because no one was. But there's this sort of myth that Germans were a good colonizer. They had short-lived colonial legacy, and then that was it. They were better again. But clearly, historically, we know that's not the case. Both Aim and Oguntoya produced new racialized and gendered knowledge that they use to connect with others. They interviewed multi-generational Black German women across West Germany and worked on research about Germany's Black diaspora. One of their critical interventions was the volume Farbekennen. So this copy of Farbekennen is not the copy from 1986. So this is the new production of Farbekennen from 2020. And this is the English translation of Farbekennen, which was called Showing Our Colors from 1992. And Farbekennen, Afrodeutsche Frauen auf den Spuren ihrer Geschichte, signified, again, this idea of another epistemic intervention. This is them creating knowledge and then disseminating that knowledge. It was published, as I mentioned briefly, in 1986 and edited by Aim, Oguntoya, and Dagmar Schultz, who is the owner of Orlando, a feminist press. And through this book, they constructed new spaces, both figuratively and literally, which enabled Black Germans to articulate claims of inclusion in the nation. Aim and Oguntoya's power functioned through their production and circulation of new ideas about Germany's Black diaspora, challenging this notion of a Germany without Blackness. The volume rehabilitated multi-generational Black German womanhood, sharing practices of intimacy and survival. In the process, they subverted the white German gaze. Aim and Oguntoya also, along with their other Black German contributors, such as Abina Aramako, Raya Libanitsky and Eleonora Wiedenroth-Kolabi discuss their common experiences of racism, in turn revealing the importance of the everyday. So a lot of these narratives, these essays in there, as well as historical essays, are all talking about different components of racism in the everyday, in advertisements, in toys, in how their white German compatriots approach them. So this is a very interesting dynamic to then write about and sort of disseminate to others. The variety of events that Black Germans organized in their movement also represented the interplay of knowledge and power, shaping their intellectual activism. Indeed, at their first 1985 national meeting of Black Germans, which took place in Wiesbaden, this meeting sparked the movement. It basically led to the origins, or led to the beginning of the Black German movement. And it's at this setting too, where they're again sharing knowledge. They're sharing stories about their childhood. They're sharing their connections with others. And they of course found connection through discussions about their isolation, through discussions about their depression and sadness of being scattered about across West Germany. And I should sort of note, many of these individuals oftentimes had limited contact to their family of African descent, depending on where they were. So in the South, around sort of military bases, there were some Black Germans who had more connection to their diasporic kin. You have a lovely scholar here who's sitting amongst us who's written a lot about that, Felicitas. So she can like wave if she wants to or not. So Felicitas right there. So she's written a lot about that. So there's this sense that when they come together though in the 80s, they don't feel isolated. They've not really seen many Black people, and they're like surprised that even they are surprised that Black people are existing in Germany. So this is striking, because they're like, what, you're Black too? And you're not speaking English, you're speaking German? So for many of them, it's like, it's startling. It's startling so much that it becomes like an emotional moment for them. And so these meetings, it's the sort of first meeting that I mentioned in 1985, become an annual tradition referred to as the Bundestreffen. And the Bundestreffens, or the BT, as I refer to them, still occur today, where they meet annually, and they oftentimes gather in like hostels, self-care spaces, and have a variety of workshops, seminars, music festivals, etc. And these spaces were important because they were away from white German gazes, particularly white racist German gazes. They address racism, racial violence, the afterlives of colonialism, all topics that oftentimes were ignored in the German mainstream. At the Bundestreffen, Black Germans also organized political workshops, historical seminars, musical performances, and other activities to help unify and socialize with one another. But again, they're also sites for intellectual exchange and edification. And these sites were where they spoke truth to power and spoke truth to the people. Through these annual events, they confronted the discursive power that remade and made their otherness. Destabilizing the power of normative knowledge and representation, Black Germans theorized, wrote, and circulated their knowledge textually, visually, and/or orally in organizational publications, workshops, and other artistic forums in the public sphere. Through a variety of events, such as the annual Black History Months, and here are two brochures. The first Black History Month took place in 1990 in Berlin, and then this is another brochure from the Black History Month in 1992. A Black Consciousness and Black Politics Conference, or a Black Women's Day workshop. For instance, Black Germans tackled the topics of anti-immigrant sentiment in Western Europe, West African politics in Mali, and/or the maintenance of Black hair. Again, topics that are oftentimes were ignored in the German mainstream, or also discussed patronizingly in the German mainstream, especially when we think about Black hair. In addition, these events functioned as a way of building a sustaining community with other Black Germans, others in the Black diaspora, and communities of color. I should also note that a lot of these events, like we oftentimes talk about racism, which is bad, clearly, and other forms of discrimination, but these moments of intellectual edification are also sites for Black joy. Like they're also having fun. They're also engaging in learning and enjoying being with each other. And together, these activities represent how diffuse power was in the movement and how Black Germans' efforts to reclaim their place in the nation occurred through the creation of alternative forms of knowledge. Organizational poetry readings, conferences, or lectures. All of these are intellectual practices that in turn opened up spaces for their causes, their histories, and identities. Of course, Reiser's activism served similar functions. Through her work in Afro-Look, she offered possibilities for the Black diaspora community and gained prominence in the same community. And here is Afro-Look, the journal that she edited. Under Reiser's direction, Afro-Look continued to promote Black internationalist perspectives and foregrounded many everyday diasporic ideas, practices, and movements, including Pan-Africanism. Afro-Look was also a form of listing, where Reiser engendered a diasporic genealogy in each of these issues. The magazine established new value systems that were disconnected from traditional German culture. Afro-Look, similar to other Black German cultural productions, became a tangible source of power for its readers and contributors alike. Reiser officially assumed the reins of Afro-Look during the 1992-1993 issue and continued as an editor until the last issue in 1999. She, of course, had been involved with previous issues, especially since 1991. Reiser worked with a diverse editorial team that included Black Germans such as Janine Kantara, Noria Ashafa, and Regina Stein. She remained a key figure associated with the movement. In my personal conversations with Reiser, she saw herself as bringing more stability and direction to the journal. Afro-Look acquired more subscribers and sold more copies under Reiser's tenure. She was delighted to integrate even more diasporic styles and genres throughout the magazine. Interestingly, she also attended additional courses and received certifications for computer skills, and she acquired new skills like Photoshop. All of these, I mean, like now we have great sophisticated material that we can use online. Back in the day, that was not the case. So you would have to actually go to classes to learn some of this stuff. And so this is where she's learning that. And this is important because she also had a child with Down syndrome. So she's negotiating work with Afro-Look as well as sort of the tension with dealing with her child. She also lamented sometimes to me that she felt like Afro-Look took more time away from her than she had. But she still tried to make Afro-Look a space for Germany's Black diaspora by Germany's Black diaspora. And this is important to note because when I'm talking about Black Germans here, but there's also a wider diaspora, Black diaspora in the German context. Expats from the US, expats from Europe, expats from various countries in Africa, also expats from Latin America and the Caribbean. So it's a dynamic, much more of a dynamic space than we tend to give it credit for. Here is also a lovely image of Reiser and one of her paintings. So she drew this called Hierarchy. And her accomplishments are even more notable because she never went to university. So she's not a university graduate. She doesn't have a BA. She's not like Maya Eam, who eventually received her MA, but then also was going on for her PhD and was writing a PhD dissertation. I stress this because it basically gets at this heart of this idea of quotidian intellectual. You don't necessarily have to have a degree to be an intellectual. This is why it makes intellectualism a bit more flexible and a bit more inclusive of what actual forms of intellectualism can constitute. And I don't think, Black Germans would not have called themselves quotidian intellectuals. This is certainly my imposition because I think they are intellectuals. They're creating knowledge in a variety of ways to a number of people, and that's intellectual. This concept also affirms that the vernacular is and has always been intellectual. So vernacular forms serve as a site for knowledge. Poetry as a site for knowledge. It's not only about sort of meaningful engagements, but it's also disseminating types of knowledge to people. And it centers, of course, this idea of quotidian intellectual centers the importance of creative work by everyday people in the everyday, oftentimes akin to what Patricia Hill Collins was talking about in her book on intellectual activism. Reiser's work was less about cultivating particular interests and maintaining the social order, as was the case with other traditional intellectuals. In addition, her political and cultural goals, she advanced the intellectuality of the everyday and subalternity to form an expansive understanding of intellectualism and anti-racism that would be beneficial for all marginalized people. She mirrored goals within the larger Black German movement. In this way, the everyday maintains more power as a critical site for inquiry and radical change. Afro-Look is one of the many examples in which you see the Black German movement centering on Black diasporic figures, everyday lives in manifold ways. In fact, Reiser symbolized an example of quotidian intellectualism par excellence. She embodied the everyday in her work as a historian, bibliophile, writer, artist, and collector. She conducted research on people across the diaspora, visited antique stores to acquire books about the Black diaspora, and integrated those findings throughout issues of Afro-Look. With Afro-Look, she helped to amplify a Black public sphere. Sharing different forms of knowledge, Reiser included interviews with diasporic figures like Fela Kuti, the sort of Nigerian artist, Spike Lee, African-American director. She included reports about Josephine Baker, medical reports for Black readers, film reviews, the list goes on. She also included narratives that she entitled The Childhood Memories. And when she would recount her experiences with some of her white racist German family members and her journey to become her true self. So some of those stories are extremely harsh and particularly powerful. And she received a letter from one of the readers of Afro-Look saying, and I quote, "With your childhood report, you gave us all Black Germans the opportunity to identify ourselves without having to take off the mask immediately," end quote. Indeed, her personal writing in Afro-Look was effective just as much as it was intellectual. This gave Reiser power and signified her willingness to allow the magazine to serve as a space for education, community, and empowerment. Similar to the dynamics in the larger Black German movement, Reiser's work affirmed that power should never assume one form. Here again, you can see some of Reiser's images. So this is an image, I basically sort of scanned an image of Afro-Look onto the PowerPoint, and you can see her artwork. And then you can also see poetry throughout. So it's not only in German, Afro-Look was also in a variety of languages, sometimes Spanish, depending on a variety of the articles that were involved. And then here you have another little image that I think is cool. And again, you can sort of see some of the artwork that she's integrating into Afro-Look. Although Reiser did not acquire Aim's stature, these women really did work to change Germany in both similar and dissimilar ways. Before Aim's international prominence, she also contributed to the Black public sphere in Germany. Her work appeared in a Germany still unable to fully come to terms with its colonial history, which included the project of terror and genocide in modern-day Namibia and Tanzania, and its disavowal of Germans of color. This epistemic work, which the larger Black German movement also consistently pursued, impelled her to address how Germany's ethnocentrism buttressed their colonial and fascist endeavors, which produced and reproduced the social political category of race and implemented particular racial regimes. Black Germans and other Germans of color were tethered to this colonial history that was simultaneously invisible and visible in the nation. Moreover, with Germany's public rejection of race and tolerance of anti-Black and cultural racisms in the post-war period, white Germans continued to evade their material, discursive, and effective effects on non-white subjects, especially Black Germans. To this effect, Aim hosted and participated in conferences in Germany that foregrounded these historical legacies and the post-colonial present, while trying to foster cross-cultural solidarities. She and Nivita Prasad, an Indian German activist, organized the 1990 conference Ways to Alliances, occurring in Bremen for ethnic and Afro-German minorities. They also organized a follow-up conference in 1991 in Berlin that addressed the plight of immigrant, Jewish, and Black German women. They published an edited volume, basically, entitled Documentation Ways to Alliance with the Revised Conference Papers. In these settings, she discussed racism and the necessity to encourage and recognize diversity in Germany. In addition, Aim excavated narratives about Blackness in Germany and Europe. She showed how Afro-German history predated the post-war period and had remained a significant part of German history. In her speeches, poetry, and prose, she offered her expertise on the deeply ingrained racialized ideas and symbols that position Black people and other people of color to be the problem, but did not recognize how many white Germans use those same so-called problems as a way to define their own personal and collective identities. And here she's saying, in creating these others, so people who are not allegedly German, so like Jews, Turkish individuals, Asian Germans, Black Germans, in creating the other, they use the other to then define who they are. So if the other is this, Germans can't be that. So that's always like an interesting construction in which they're always excluded in this larger narrative. She critiqued the discourses advanced by German government and media by arguing that they sustained a system that indoctrinated a susceptible public. In her critique, the racist German culture manufactured discourses on integration and multiculturalism that ironically served to silence German minorities, preventing much needed dialogue and transformation from taking place. And here is Mai at a lovely reading. Reading her, she's reading from an edited volume entitled, it's titled Infanta Verbindungen, so distant ties. And here is another image of Mai with Guadalupean writer Marcel Condé in 1994 in Berlin. They're on a panel together. And Condé's confirmed this idea of dialogue and solidarity that Aim really pushes in her a variety of invitations. And Condé says about Mai, her exceptional voice, unique, and already in the hearts of all of us who are persecuted and thirsty. Aim used her appeal in cultural productions to bolster her position and to retain recognition for her causes and community. She integrated diasporic themes and tropes in her poetry, privileging diverse Black diasporic knowledge forms. Her literature and later doctoral work in education also gave her an opportunity to share specific knowledge about the history and plight of Afro-Germans and use it to not only forge connections with others, but to incite social change. Her international travel included her involvement with anti-racist causes across and beyond the European continent, which also had didactic purposes. She participated in the first, well, she didn't participate in the first one, but she participated in the International Book Fair of Radical Black and Third World Books in 1993, but the first book fair occurred in 1982. And she basically connected with a lot of diasporic intellectuals and activists. And again, this event, which annually took place in London, demonstrates how the constitutive nature of knowledge and power, and how they offered opportunities for critical exchange and the circulation of different forms of knowledge. These book fairs in London were organized by John LaRose, who is a Black British activist. And these events were also about Black European solidarity. And she connected with Linton Kwesi Johnson, who is a Jamaican British dub poet, Guyanan-born British editor and writer Margaret Bibsby, and French journalist and activist Mojis Adala, all at these different third world book fairs. As her friend and co-founder of ISD, David Niadi explained, her concise, sharp, sometimes humorous descriptions added a soundtrack to the painful experiences of a whole generation and resisted the presumptions of an arrogant and equally ignorant dominant majority society. In addition, Mai also performed at the 1994 annual Panifest Symposium in Ankara, Ghana. This is not of Mai in Ghana, this is of Mai in South Africa, but I'll talk a little bit about her experience in South Africa. She presented a paper entitled People of African Descent in Europe, the Afro-German Experience. She connected again with multiple scholars across the diaspora. It's at this Ankara conference that she became more acquainted with West African and Dikara symbols, which she later incorporated into her poetry volume, Blues in Schwarz-Weiß, or Blues in Black-White. And it was basically her first poetry volume that she published in 1995. With this conscious deployment of diasporic symbolism in her work, she also privileged the visual as a viable form of knowledge. She participated in a cultural festival in South Africa during the same year. So she participated in a variety of cultural festivals and throughout South Africa. And she remained attuned to intercultural connections and diasporic politics, signaling her internationalism with both political and personal. In essence, these narratives reveal the intellectual practices of Black German women like Aim and Reiser, but also Oguntoya, Emda, etc., who documented and curated their movement. By doing so, they demonstrated how these radical acts reflected their ability to gain power and agency by determining the significance of their movement in non-normative and anti-racist ways. Reiser, Aim, and others decolonized public sphere and acknowledged rather than bracketed their differences, showing how they were constitutive parts of the nation and their organizing. In this way, knowledge did not function through the state or federal institutions per se, but through their intellectual activism in both private and public ways. Additionally, both Reiser and Aim have left legacies as dynamic quotidian intellectuals. They built networks and connections with Black Germans, people in the diaspora, people of color in Germany, and others abroad. Moreover, their diasporic and feminist politics undergirded their internationalism. In the process, they are imagined the role of intellectuals, marking Black Germans as poets and thinkers, or Dichter and Denker in their own right. Thank you so much.
I think we have to share this microphone so that everybody on Zoom can hear us. Thank you very much for a really wonderful and stimulating talk. And we're going to go ahead and take questions. Why don't we take questions from the audience here, and then we'll also monitor the chat to take questions from people who are on Zoom. So does anybody in the audience have a question we can start with? Okay, I think I can walk with this. Then we'll, oh, there we go, look at that, okay.
Hi, thank you so much for a really wonderful talk. My question is, given that you're talking about the 80s and the 90s, this is a time that coincided with German reunification, and I'm really curious to know, how did, was there an equivalent of such a movement in East Germany, and what happened after reunification?
People hear me?
Oh, but I don't think they can hear me. I'm here. Okay. Zoom peeps, can you hear me? Okay. I can hear. Okay.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I'm sorry I refer to you as Zoom peeps, but yes, there was a ISD group in East Berlin that was connected with the ISD group in West Berlin. So this is before the fall of the wall. And so they were organizing events. That sort of work becomes combined after the fall of the wall. And then they have a variety of other ISD groups across Dresden, Leipzig, none in Rostock, but other sort of East German cities that they had sort of ISD groups. And that I think in 1993, one of the first Bundestreffens takes place in Leipzig. So there's an effort to, especially after the fall of the wall, to really connect with East German, their Black East German sisters and brothers. And then Audre Lorde also visited in 1990, Black East Germans and gave talks as well. So there's some connection there. And then there's further connections that I didn't necessarily talk about in the book as much, or in the paper, in the paper. Any other questions? Oh, that's wrong. Sorry. There is a question in the chat. Is it okay if I take it? Okay. Hi, Anne. Yeah, I mentioned that in the intro to my book, you mentioned that several of these women were also lesbians or queer, as was Lord. Yep. And you talk about Black German intellectuals pursuing queer strategies. Could you please say more about this aspect? Absolutely. So Katharina, one of the images of Katharina, she was one of the maybe most prominent Black German lesbian. So many saw her as a model. Diaspora was actually founded at her apartment. They were meeting basically in her kitchen to connect. And this is where, Diaspora becomes a feminist movement. It's driven largely in the beginning by a lot of Black German lesbians. I mean, I'm sure they, for sort of generational issues, would not necessarily call themselves queer. I think that's much more of a modern nomenclature. Yeah. But they were very much grounded in a lesbian Black aesthetic and activist motivations and perspectives. And what I mean by sort of Black queer strategies, Black Germans are already inherently queer because they're against the norm. The norm in the German context is considered white, cisgender, non-queer, and their actual being helps to show that they're already engaging in queer strategies. So there's a doubling and oftentimes a tripling idea of what queerness can mean: sexual identity, non-normative behaviors and practices, and also who they were in and of themselves. So queer can mean a variety of things, and for them it does. So it doesn't only mean sexual identity, it oftentimes means their way of articulating the cultural and political identity as well.
Thank you so much.
That answers it, Anne.
Yes, thank you very much.
You're welcome. Not all at once. It's too overwhelming. Okay. Do I come to you? Yeah, I can come to you.
I was just going to ask if you could talk a little bit about how these women are remembered today and what the kind of contemporary Afro-Black German movement looks like.
Yeah, that's a very great question. All of these questions are good. Yeah, so, and oftentimes people are also like, where are the fellas? Where are the Black German fellas? Are they all up in the mix? Yes, I do talk about them in the book. They're all up in the mix. But Black German women in particular are considered the real spark to the movement. Like, it's their sort of kitchen table meetings, for example, across a variety of German cities that allowed the movement to have the force that it did. So as I mentioned, there were local groups, for example, not only in Berlin, but in Frankfurt and Munich and Cologne and Bremen. And so all of these chapters really relied on the sort of word of mouth connections that women had already formed on the ground. And also to sort of briefly talk about Felicita's work, she talks about the sort of connection of women. Diasporic women are key to how these solidarities and moments of resistance get articulated and expressed. And that's no different. And when we think about like Black Lives Matter, there's a Black Lives Matter chapter in Berlin founded in 2016. They see Aim and Oguntoya as like these models. And they see they really consider the work to be significant. Sadly, they're still pushing for similar things, sort of especially thinking about anti-racist legislation, pushing for more quantitative data about racism and discrimination in employment and housing. There was actually an Afro census that took place in Germany, published report in November of 2021 that said, Germany's racist in a lot of levels, bad. Now we have, certainly not in that professional language. They were very more serious, but they're basically saying, look, there's racism in employment and it's anti-Black racism. So when we oftentimes talk about our experiences, when Black Germans say, when we talk about our experiences and people think we're being sensitive, we now have proof to show you that it's not sensitivity. It's actually a reality, that we're being turned away from apartments, that we're not being employed in a variety of sectors, et cetera. So that's a push that Black Germans wanted in the 1980s and the 1990s. So there's documentation that I've come across in which they're like, we need to push to have a statistics about discrimination. And now in 2019, 21st century, we have this Afro census that tells us this. That's huge. I swear I don't bite. Unless you're a cookie. Okay.
I was wondering if you could talk a little more about the transnational aspects of the movement and like a broader kind of Afro-European movement and how the German movement fits within that and over that kind of historical period to today.
Okay, that's a good question again. Yeah, they're connecting with that image of John LaRose that I mentioned. They're going to, IEM in particular, but John Kantara, Ni Adi, they're all going to these third world book fairs, and they're meeting other Black and people of color Europeans in this so communities of color in Europe. They're meeting at those book fairs, and then they found an organization, IEM and John LaRose and Ni Adi, they found a anti-racist organization in 1990 that helped to sort of tackle the increasing it was sort of claimed xenophobia in the European context, but was also quite about sort of racism. So it's about sort of anti-foreign sentiment, and to be exact, of course, of sort of thinking about immigrants and migrants coming into Europe, oftentimes non-white immigrants and migrants coming to Europe, much like today, hello, the Mediterranean. But at this time, they're sort of pushing for a more political approach to tackling that. So there's also in the 80s, the late 80s and the 90s, there's a rise in far-right activism and far-right politics. And so that group was a response to that. How do we sort of make collective change that tackles these dynamics in a conducive way? And IEM and Oguntoya are connected to other third world, now we would consider it global South, feminist movements. They're going to feminist conferences across the globe. So Nigeria, New Zealand, they're going to events in Brazil. I mean, they're also connecting with South African activists. They're involved in this anti-apartheid. Mai was involved in the anti-apartheid movement. There was a vibrant movement in Berlin, in West Berlin at this time. And then of course, after the wall falls. So they're really connected to a variety of movements, all trying to tackle anti-racism. They're also connected to, Mai gets involved in human rights activism. She's doing a lot of work outside of the Black German movement. She's very keen on working with migrant women, helping to give them a platform, helping to give them a space in Germany. She's also connected with there's like a variety of human rights organizations in West Germany that she's connected with. So she's outside of this realm of just being within the Black German movement. She sees discrimination, intersecting discrimination. So when we think about like intersectionality now, or like, ooh, critical race theory, I'm gonna die because I said it. So I may disappear after saying it. She's seeing that as a way of, making concrete change, because it's not only for Mai and for so many Black Germans, it's not only about tackling anti-Black racism, it's about tackling anti-Turkish racism, anti-Roma racism. It's tackling this notion that Germans are only white. And so this is something that they're constantly talking about and constantly trying to sort of work around. I'm gonna come to you. I feel like Vanna, but I don't have letters. Sorry about that.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. In the beginning, you said that a lot of the Black Germans are like trying to find their way together. Is that still the case in 2020?
That's a good question.
That, and two, has there been like significant progress with the Blacks in Germany, or are they still struggling?
These are good questions. Okay. Ooh. I'm just gonna not put it so close. Yeah, that's a good question. Oh, I did put it too close. Sorry. I promise I do know how to do this. Yeah, so there are still struggles. And I think this is a larger discussion across Europe that like when we thought about Black Lives Matter in the US in the summer of 2020, there were Black Lives Matter movements across Europe challenging colonialism. So they're basically knocking down statues, knocking down the statue of Leopold in Belgium, Amsterdam, Copenhagen, Germany alone had over 29 cities of protests for George Floyd. So they're connecting with George Floyd, but they're also stressing police brutality in Germany. They're also stressing racial profiling in Germany. They're also stressing the legacies and aftermaths of colonialism across the continent. So on one hand, you have like Black German and Afro-German are in the German dictionary, Duden, which is like a prominent German dictionary. If you've made it in Duden, you know you've made it. But this doesn't, you know, it's like Duden, yeah. But it doesn't mean that racism is over. So like they come together. Now there's so much more so many more organizations aside from ISD and ADEFRA, which still exists in Germany. There are countless other queer Black groups, community of color Black groups across Berlin, Frankfurt, Hamburg, Munich going on. So they're not as isolated. I should also note there's certainly some distinctions in terms of thinking about the rural-urban divide. You know, mostly these are in major cities. So there's still some isolation for, you know, Germans of color, Black Germans who are in rural areas. But they're coming together in a much more sort of useful way, and they're using digital activism to do so. They're using the digital spaces to connect. So they're telling you you're able to like gather people in a matter of minutes to organize a protest, to organize an event about police brutality, to organize an event about racial profiling, to organize an event about this anti-discriminatory practice that occurred. So they're able to come together a little bit more easily now, whereas before they were like telephoning each other, hi, like literally old school, like, hey, I met another Black German, come to this meeting. They're putting advertisements in the newspaper. They're putting advertisements in the radio. They're doing it by word of mouth. They're going to actually people's homes. So it's different from like pulling up on Twitter and going, there's a protest at 5 o'clock, come, or like come to this group, you know, come to this space on Twitter where we can talk about these events. Even now, thinking about Ukraine, there's a group, it's a cultural archive, a library, etc., called Each One Teach One in Berlin. And it actually, Each One Teach One has Ricky Reiser's library there. So she, when I mentioned, she's a bibliophile. They've now helped to try to collect materials for particularly students who were trapped. So African students who were trapped, Pakistani students who were trapped, and Indian students who are trapped at the borders and not being able to go through to Poland, etc. So they're helping those students and trying to get them into Germany. So they're still doing that activism, and it's mobilized through, like, interestingly enough, like Twitter and Facebook. Oh, okay, Anne, you're like, okay, could you talk about how you got involved with this research topic and how you got started, how you found these archival documents, how you met these women? Whoa, Anne, that's a lot. I'll do my best. I lived in Germany as an exchange student. I was like 18 and I lived in Hofheim first, which is like a town near Frankfurt with a temporary host family. And then I moved to Hamburg, which is in the northern part of the country, and was living with my permanent host family. And I had all these racializing experiences happening to me. At my gymnasium, my local high school, someone said the N-word. In my neighborhood, someone asked me if I knew Lauryn Hill. I was like, oh, we don't have a code. Like, we're just not in a Black club where I can like say, hey, Lauren, everything is everything. Meet you at the corner. So like all of these interestingly, what we would call now microaggressions, which weren't really microaggressions. They were like very macro to me. At one point, someone said that it's your fault that the Nigerian drug dealers are here. And I was like, I'm not Nigerian. We're not gonna, again, it's not like I don't have a black card. We don't show each other cards or do like high fives. So all of these things happened. And so it made me intrigued to know about Black German experiences. Since I was an American and this was happening to me, I was non-native. And I got all of this stuff. How were native Black Germans dealing with this? And that was how I got involved in it. I basically, many of the sources that I came across weren't in archives. They were in people's homes. So I was actually at kitchen tables talking with people. They invited me over. They had to like give me a test first to make sure that I was like, okay, that I was legit. So I would like meet them at cafes where they would like, you know, give me all of these questions and like look me up and down, like, who's this American? What's she doing here? And then after I passed the test, they would talk to me. And then they were like, do you think these sources? So I had mold in my Berlin apartment, and I ended up staying with Ria Cheatham, who's an activist in Adefra and also ISD Munich. And she pulls up and shows me like a suitcase of sources. And she says, do you think this would be useful? And I was like, what? So I did say, what? Oh my God. And so I started looking at the sources at her table, talking to her about her time. And then, you know, Katerina Montoya invited me to her apartment. And she's like, we organized Adefra over there. And so like, it's my personal kinships with some of these activists that also helped me to write this narrative. So they're not housed in archives, which again, I think speaks to some of the larger institutional issues in Germany, that they don't necessarily trust German institutions to house these materials. This is why on a site like Each One Teach One is so important, because it's actually one of the first sites for like Black German archive. So.
That's incredibly inspirational. Thank you.
Oh, thanks. Do you want me to come to you? Okay. Yeah, that's a good question. So I think in many ways, African Americans have like a get out of racism free card sometimes in Europe, because there's always these narratives that you hear about like Paris or Berlin and London, where like, ooh, I've not experienced any racism. It's because you're not from the country, and you do, you have an American passport. But that sometimes flips based on the location and where you are. And so I think on one hand, there's American privilege that allows you to have access to these spaces. If you can travel alone, if you can travel to Europe alone, that's privilege. So you do have like an American privilege. But it's also like, heavily racialized. So like, for example, when I was in Germany in 2016, this was also during the Syrian crisis and Syrian migration. It was one of the few times that I felt like I needed to take my passport around so that people weren't, accosting me as an African migrant. I was worried that was going to happen. I was also pregnant, so I was like, I don't need to be jostled. So I needed to not worry about that. And so that moment, like my pass helped me. But then in everyday racism, people see me as a Black person. They don't see me as an American. So they see me, oftentimes I'm coded, as like maybe African. So like they ignore me. And it's like my partner is white. And so as soon as if I'm at a grocery store, for example, and I'm waiting there, I'm waiting to be, everybody else has come after me. They're all other white Germans have come after me. I'm waiting to I've been there before other people. The woman doesn't look at me, doesn't acknowledge me. I bring my husband over, immediately her eye hits to me. I can push him away. And then I'm like, hey, I want to order this. I don't push him violently, but I'm like, get away so I can order my food. But this is like everyday racism, or the questions that Black Germans oftentimes get. How do you speak German so well? Like, where are you from? And they're like, I'm from Berlin, or I'm from Frankfurt, I'm from Passau. And they're like, where are you really from? And they're like, I'm from Passau. So those are intricacies where people presume, where Germans presume you're not, you can't be German. Like what are you doing here? And the same, I think, sort of similar dynamics about racialization occur in France, and Britain too. Like, but there's a larger colonial legacy. So there's a larger visible presence of those subjects in these spaces than in the German context. So I think that complicates it as well. Any other questions? Okay, well, thank you for coming. Have a nice one. Thanks for attending. Zoom peeps.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody.